There is something I want to share with you that took me years of working with avoidant individuals in clinical practice to truly understand. Once you recognize it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Suddenly, so many of the confusing, contradictory, and frustrating conversations you've had with an avoidant begin to make sense. The moments that left you questioning whether the connection between you was ever real start to look completely different. One of the biggest misconceptions about avoidant attachment is the belief that avoidants experience love less deeply than everyone else. In reality, the difference is rarely about the depth of their emotions. It is about the way those emotions are managed, expressed, and protected. They do not usually experience love and then naturally communicate it the way someone with secure attachment often does. For a securely attached person, emotions and expression tend to move together. Affection grows, vulnerability feels manageable, and eventually those feelings are shared openly. There is a natural progression from emotion to communication, making it easier for both people to understand where they stand. For an avoidant, however, the process often moves in the opposite direction. As their feelings become stronger, so does their instinct to protect themselves from the vulnerability those feelings create. The more attached they become, the more their nervous system pushes them toward hiding, minimizing, or disguising what they feel. Instead of expressing love directly, they unconsciously redirect it into behaviors and conversations that feel emotionally safer. This is why loving an avoidant can feel so confusing. They often communicate through signals that most people were never taught to recognize. If you have been trying to understand them using the emotional language of someone who expresses affection openly and directly, you have probably misunderstood many moments that were actually quiet admissions of love hidden beneath layers of emotional protection. Today, I want to help you recognize that hidden language. Not the rare occasions when an avoidant unexpectedly says, "I love you," or openly reveals their emotions. Those moments certainly happen, but they are uncommon. Instead, I want to focus on the subtle, everyday statements that seem ordinary or even dismissive, but can actually reveal that their feelings have already become very deep. One of the first surprising signs often sounds nothing like romance. It frequently appears as criticism that nobody asked for. At first glance, that sounds almost impossible to believe, but stay with me for a moment. When an avoidant begins falling in love, their attention shifts in a remarkable way. They stop seeing only the broad outline of who you are and begin noticing the smallest, most personal details. Their mind starts collecting observations that most people would never even register. They notice the exact way you wrap your hands around a coffee mug. They recognize the subtle difference between your voice when you are genuinely excited and when you are simply trying to sound enthusiastic. They remember tiny habits, repeated phrases, nervous gestures, routines, and inconsistencies that almost everyone else overlooks. Eventually, they comment on one of these details. The problem is that it often comes out sounding awkward, blunt, or slightly critical. Rather than saying, "I love how carefully you think," they may point out how long you take to make decisions. Instead of saying, "I notice every little thing about you," they might casually mention a habit you didn't even realize you had. To someone unfamiliar with avoidant attachment, these comments can sound judgmental or unnecessarily analytical. But underneath them is something much more significant. That level of observation is not casual. It means you occupy mental space they rarely allow another person to enter. Avoidants do not usually invest this kind of attention in people who are emotionally unimportant to them. Their emotional defenses encourage distance, not detailed curiosity. So when they begin tracking your patterns, remembering your routines, and noticing the smallest changes in your behavior, it often reflects emotional investment they are not comfortable admitting, even to themselves. The criticism is rarely the real message. The real message is, "I've been paying attention." It is, "I notice things about you that no one else seems to notice." And perhaps most importantly, it quietly says, you matter enough that my mind keeps collecting information about you. Because direct affection feels dangerously exposing, those observations often emerge disguised as analysis instead of admiration. Their attention slips out sideways, hidden beneath practical comments or seemingly unnecessary critiques. What sounds like distance is sometimes evidence of closeness they have not yet learned how to express safely. Understanding this doesn't mean every critical remark from an avoidant is secretly an expression of love. People can certainly criticize for unhealthy reasons as well. But when these detailed observations appear alongside growing consistency, emotional investment, and increasing presence, they often reveal something much deeper than the words themselves ever communicate. The comment is simply the surface. The attention behind it is the part that truly matters. What those small observations really reveal is this: you have taken up space in their inner world. You are on their mind far more than they would ever admit. Their attention keeps returning to you in ways they cannot easily control. That kind of sustained awareness does not happen towards someone they feel indifferent about. People do not memorize tiny habits or silently collect details about someone who means nothing to them. An avoidant who has fallen in love often cannot stop noticing you. Every expression, routine, habit, and subtle change begins to register. Yet saying, "I think about you all the time," feels unbearably exposing. Their nervous system experiences that level of honesty as emotional danger. So instead of openly admitting how much space you occupy in their thoughts, the feelings leak out through casual observations, unexpected comments, or seemingly unnecessary critiques. The commentary becomes a safer substitute for the confession they cannot comfortably make. Another phrase you will often hear from an avoidant who is already emotionally invested is some version of, "I'm not good at this." Most people hear those words as a warning. They assume the avoidant is lowering expectations or preparing an excuse for future distance. It can sound like someone quietly announcing that disappointment is inevitable. Sometimes that interpretation is accurate, but in the context of a relationship that has been growing deeper, I have repeatedly seen something much more vulnerable hiding beneath those words. Very often, what they are truly expressing is, "I wish I knew how to do this well with you, and the fact that I care this much scares me." They rarely recognize that this is what they are communicating. From their perspective, they believe they are simply being realistic or honest about their limitations. Yet underneath that practical explanation sits a genuine fear of failing someone who has become emotionally significant. Without realizing it, they begin comparing themselves to an invisible standard. They wonder whether they can give the relationship what it deserves. They question whether they are capable of meeting your emotional needs. They worry that their own patterns, fears, and limitations will eventually hurt someone they genuinely care about. Those thoughts only emerge when the relationship matters. People do not lose sleep wondering whether they are enough for someone they barely care about. They do not become anxious about disappointing a person who has no emotional importance in their life. That fear only develops when there is something precious at stake. When an avoidant says, "I'm not good at relationships," or "I'm not very good at this," they are often revealing something much deeper than insecurity. They are exposing the possibility that they already value the connection enough to fear losing it. Their concern is not simply about relationships in general. It is about this relationship with this person, and the possibility that they may not know how to protect something they already treasure. Another statement that carries enormous meaning is some variation of, "You're different." This can sound very different depending on the individual. Sometimes it is spoken softly, almost with surprise, as though they are discovering something they cannot quite explain. Other times it comes across more defensively, almost as if your differences have unsettled them or disrupted something they depended upon. In some cases, it appears almost casually in the middle of another conversation, slipping out before they even realize the significance of what they have said. Regardless of how it is delivered, those three words often signal that something important has shifted inside them. Avoidants usually develop highly organized ways of understanding understanding other people. These internal categories help them predict behavior, maintain emotional control, and keep relationships at a distance that feels manageable. They become very skilled at recognizing familiar patterns because predictability creates safety. When someone fits neatly into those expectations, the avoidant knows how to navigate the relationship without feeling overwhelmed. But occasionally, someone refuses to fit. That person continues behaving in ways the avoidant never expected. They respond with patience instead of pressure. They remain consistent where others disappeared. They understand emotional boundaries without trying to force intimacy. They reach beneath the avoidant's protective surface without making them feel trapped or controlled. Suddenly, the familiar mental categories stop working. The avoidant cannot place you where they normally place everyone else. Their usual explanations no longer make sense. Their predictions fail. The emotional blueprint they have relied on for years begins to fall apart because your behavior keeps challenging everything they assumed relationships were supposed to be. When they finally tell you you're different, they are often acknowledging something much larger than your personality. They are admitting that you have disrupted a system that has protected them for most of their life. And for someone whose entire emotional world depends on predictability and control, that is one of the clearest signs that genuine love has already begun to reshape their internal landscape. When an avoidant tells you you're different, they are often describing something their inner world was never prepared for. Those words reflect a moment when their usual way of understanding relationships no longer works. Their emotional system has encountered someone it cannot process using its familiar rules. In other words, you have reached a place very few people ever reach. That doesn't mean every emotional wall has disappeared. Avoidants rarely lower all of their defenses at once. Their protective layers were built over years, sometimes decades, and genuine closeness unfolds gradually rather than all at once. Loving an avoidant is rarely simple, predictable, or perfectly linear. But if they tell you that you are different, it usually means you have gone far enough beneath the surface that they can no longer place you into the same categories they use for everyone else. Their carefully organized understanding of relationships now has to expand to include someone who does not fit the old patterns. Instead of relying on familiar assumptions, they are forced to make room for something entirely new. That kind of adjustment is emotionally significant for anyone, but for an avoidant, it represents a profound internal shift. Another phrase that often confuses people is perhaps the most paradoxical of all. It sounds something like, I don't need anyone. When those words are spoken in the middle of a relationship that is becoming increasingly meaningful, they are often revealing the exact opposite of what they appear to say. Rather than announcing complete independence, the avoidant is frequently reacting to the frightening realization that they are beginning to rely on someone emotionally. They are not simply describing themselves, they are trying to regain control. Inside, something unfamiliar has started happening. They notice you crossing their mind when you are not around. They recognize that your absence leaves an emotional imprint that never existed before. They begin caring about your presence in ways that feel unsettling because those feelings challenge the identity they have spent years protecting. For someone whose sense of safety has always depended on emotional self-sufficiency, this can feel like an internal emergency. Their mind immediately tries to restore the old story. I don't need anyone. I've always been fine on my own. I don't depend on people. These statements become emotional armor. They are an attempt to convince themselves that nothing fundamental has changed, that the growing attachment they just experienced is temporary or imagined. But the need to defend their independence is often evidence that something has, in fact, changed. If there were no emotional dependence developing, there would be nothing to defend against. The protest itself becomes a clue. It suggests that their emotional world is shifting in ways they are struggling to accept. One of the quietest and perhaps most revealing expressions of love appears not in what they say about their feelings, but in the small ways they begin protecting you. Not through dramatic romantic gestures, not through elaborate declarations. Instead, through ordinary moments that almost disappear if you are not paying attention. They quietly remove obstacles from your path. They make a situation easier for you without mentioning it afterward. They speak well of you when you are not there to defend yourself. They consider your comfort before making a decision. They remember something that matters to you and act on it without expecting gratitude or recognition. Each action seems insignificant on its own. Each one can easily be explained away as simple kindness, common courtesy, or practicality. Yet taken together, they tell a much larger story. Avoidants often struggle to verbalize tenderness because direct emotional expression feels intensely vulnerable. Saying, "I care deeply about you," may feel overwhelming. Doing something thoughtful, however, feels safer. Their affection becomes action instead of announcement. The care is hidden inside behavior rather than spoken aloud. Over the years, one lesson has become increasingly clear to me. The most meaningful expressions of love are often the ones people never draw attention to. Anyone can make a dramatic declaration in the right moment, but consistently making another person's life a little easier, a little safer, or a little less burdensome without seeking praise is a very different kind of communication. For many avoidants, these quiet acts are among the loudest emotional statements they are capable of making. They may never point to those moments or explain what motivated them. In fact, they often hope you won't notice, because acknowledging the tenderness behind those actions would require confronting emotions they are still learning how to tolerate. But beneath the practical decisions, the thoughtful gestures, and the unnoticed acts of protection lies a simple truth. They are caring for you in the language that currently feels safest. Until they become capable of expressing love directly, these small, consistent actions often become their most honest form of emotional communication. Their love may not always arrive through beautiful words. Sometimes it arrives through quiet protection, silent consideration, and ordinary moments that reveal an extraordinary level of care to anyone who knows how to recognize the language behind them. As we reach the end of this discussion, there is something I believe is just as important as everything we've explored so far. Learning to recognize the hidden language of an avoidant can be incredibly valuable. It helps you understand that withdrawal is not always the same as indifference, that criticism is not always rejection, and that repeated claims of independence do not necessarily mean the relationship has no emotional significance. Seeing these patterns more clearly can spare you from many painful misunderstandings and allow you to interpret their behavior with greater accuracy. But there is an important boundary that must never be overlooked. Understanding an avoidant's emotional language does not mean you are responsible for translating it forever. There comes a point where insight alone is no longer enough. While it is helpful to recognize what their indirect words and actions may truly mean, healthy relationships cannot survive indefinitely on interpretation. Love should not remain permanently hidden behind coded messages, subtle hints, or emotional puzzles that only one person is trying to solve. Eventually, every relationship needs clarity. You deserve affection that reaches you without requiring constant analysis. You deserve words that reflect genuine feelings instead of forcing you to search beneath every conversation for hidden meaning. Your nervous system deserves the peace that comes from knowing where you stand, rather than living in a continual state of uncertainty, trying to determine whether every small gesture is a sign of love or another step toward distance. This is where many people become confused. They assume that if they understand avoidant attachment well enough, they can somehow love an avoidant into expressing themselves more openly. Unfortunately, that is not how healing works. An avoidant absolutely has the capacity to grow. They can become more emotionally available. They can learn to communicate directly, tolerate vulnerability, and build relationships that feel safer and more secure for both people. Countless individuals have done exactly that. But that transformation cannot be completed by someone who loves them. It requires the avoidant to confront the fears that made emotional closeness feel dangerous in the first place. It requires self-awareness, honest reflection, and a willingness to challenge lifelong protective patterns. No amount of patience, reassurance, sacrifice, or unconditional love can do that work on their behalf. The only part that truly belongs to you is understanding what you are witnessing. Your role is not to become a permanent interpreter. Your role is to recognize the truth of your own experience. If you noticed the quiet attention they gave you, if you felt the small ways they protected you, if you sensed the tenderness hidden beneath awkward words and indirect expressions, you were not necessarily imagining those things. Very often, they were real. An avoidant who has fallen deeply in love may be one of the most privately devoted people you will ever meet. Their feelings often run far deeper than they know how to express. The challenge is not the absence of love. The challenge is that the love struggles to find a voice that feels emotionally safe. That is why their affection so often appears through consistency instead of declarations, thoughtful actions instead of speeches, silent loyalty instead of dramatic romance, and quiet presence instead of constant reassurance. The love exists. It simply remains filtered through layers of protection that they have not yet learned to lower. Whether you choose to remain in that relationship or decide that your own emotional needs require something more direct is entirely your decision. Neither choice is selfish. Neither choice is a failure. Choosing to stay with someone who is genuinely committed to healing can be an act of hope. Choosing to leave because you need openness, consistency, and emotional clarity can be an act of self-respect. Both decisions deserve compassion. What matters most is that you do not invalidate your own reality. So many people leave relationships with avoidance believing they imagined everything, that the connection was one-sided, that the affection was never genuine, or that every meaningful moment was simply wishful thinking. That conclusion is not always true. Sometimes what you experienced was exactly what you believed it was. The lingering eye contact, the detailed observations, the quiet concern, the subtle protection. The moments when they almost admitted what they felt before retreating behind another emotional wall. Those moments carried meaning. They reflected a love that was imperfect, cautious, frightened, and deeply conflicted, but love nonetheless. Recognizing that truth does not mean you must wait forever for someone to change. It simply means you no longer have to question your own perception. You can acknowledge that the connection was real, while also recognizing that love by itself is not always enough to sustain a healthy relationship. In the end, the greatest gift you can give yourself is balance. See the love for what it was. See the limitations for what they were. Hold compassion for the person they were struggling to become, but also hold compassion for yourself and the kind of relationship you deserve. Because understanding an avoidant is valuable, but understanding your own needs is just as important. And no matter which path you choose, never let anyone convince you that the quiet expressions of care you experienced were meaningless. They were real. They were imperfect. They were hidden behind fear, but they were still expressions of love, and you were not wrong to recognize them.